Good morning. Continuing reading. The psychic disassociation effect of propaganda. Philip de Felice has said that propaganda creates a tendency to manic depressive neurosis. This is obviously an exaggeration, but it is true that propaganda puts the individual through successive periods of exaltation and depression caused by exposing him to alternate propaganda themes. We have already analyzed the necessity for alternating themes, for example, alternating those of terror and of self-assertion. The result is a continuous emotional contrast which can become very dangerous for individuals exposed to it. Like the shock of contradictory propaganda, this can be one of the causes of psychic disassociation, though it does not have to lead to mental illness, as Felice suggests. There's a footnote. One element we must remember is the overexcitement that propaganda provokes. The propagandee is constantly urged to action and often prevented from accomplishing it. His certainties are absolute, he is constantly overexcited by them, and his ever renewed aggression toward the symbols of his own culture leads him rather quickly to disintegration as a result of the extreme discrepancies between this overexcitement and his social milieu. At this point, we shall lay aside the observable disassociations in the propagandee between public opinion and his personal opinion. We have already said that propaganda produces a deep separation between the two. There's a big footnote. One aspect of the disassociation which Stolypin had justly emphasized in the evolution psychology, whatever, I can't pronounce that, had justly emphasized in the division. Okay, I'm going to start this over. This is the footnote. One aspect of the dissociation which Stolypin had justly emphasized in the division of consciousness into three compartments. Aligned consciousness, a term frequently employed in the Stalin regime, refers to the conscious citizen of the socialist epoch who lives in official truth, performs a consistent action, and is completely socialized. This aligned consciousness is a creation of propaganda, but beneath it exists a premeditated consciousness, the level at which the citizen personalizes the data of propaganda and persuades himself that the regime is good. The level at which he works out justifications and decisions for behavior which will conform to social demands in such a way as to make him least aware of his bad conscience. Finally, there exists a secret consciousness comprising the refusals, the protestations, the judgments against the regime, combined with a tendency toward cynicism or belief in Christianity. But this secret consciousness is completely repressed, encircled, and constrained, and must struggle against interdictions such as man's spontaneous impulses have never before encountered. Okay. Alright, I'm just gonna go. At this point, we shall lay aside the observable disassociations in the propagandee between public opinion and his personal opinion. We have already said that propaganda produces a deep separation between the two. Instead, we shall stress the disassociation between thought and action, which seems to us of the most disturbing facts of our time. Nowadays, man acts without thinking, and in turn, his thought can no longer be translated into action. Thinking has become a superfluous exercise. Without reference to reality, it is purely internal, without compelling force, more or less a game. It is literature's domain, and I am not referring solely to intellectual thought, but to all thought, whether it concerns work or politics or family life. In sum, thought and reflection have been rendered thoroughly pointless by the circumstances in which modern man lives and acts. He does not need to think in order to act. His action is determined by the techniques he uses and by the sociological conditions. He acts without really wanting to, without ever reflecting on the meaning of or reasons for his action. This situation is the result of the whole evolution of our society. The schools, the press, and social pragmatism are just as responsible for this psychotechnics. The school, the press, and social pragmatism are just as responsible for this as psychotechnics, the modern political structure, and the obsession with productivity. But the two decisive factors are the mechanization of work and propaganda. The mechanization of work is based entirely on disassociation. Those who think, establish the schedules, or set the norms, never act, and those who act must do something according to rules, patterns, and plans imposed on them from outside. Above all, they must not reflect on their actions. They cannot do so anyhow, because of the speed with which they work. The modern ideal appears to be a reduction of action to complete automatism. This is considered to be a great benefit to the worker, who can dream or think of other things while working. But this disassociation, which lasts 8 hours a day, must necessarily affect all the rest of his behavior. The other element that plays a decisive role in this connection is propaganda. Remember that propaganda seeks to induce action, adherence, and participation with as little thought as possible. There's a footnote to this is connected, for example, the phenomenon of privatization and elasticity of reasoning, as well as the divergence between opinion and action, which we have studied above. According to propaganda, it is useless, even harmful, for man to think. Thinking prevents him from acting with the required righteousness and simplicity. Action must come directly from the depths of the unconscious. It must release tension, become a reflex. This presumes that thought unfolds on an entirely unreal level, that it never engages in political decisions. And this is in fact so. No political thought that is at all coherent or distinct can possibly be applied. What man thinks either is totally without effect or must remain unsaid. This is the basic condition of the political organization of the modern world, and propaganda is the instrument to attain this effect. An example that shows the radical devaluation of thought is the transformation of words in propaganda. There, language, the instrument of the mind, becomes pure sound, the symbol directly invoking feelings and reflexes. This is one of the most serious disassociations that propaganda causes. There is another, the dissociation between the verbal universe in which propaganda makes us live and reality. Propaganda sometimes deliberately separates from man's real world the verbal world that it creates. It then tends to destroy man's conscience. In connection with the problem of disassociation, we must now examine the case of an individual subjected to two intense, opposing propagandas equally close to him. Such a situation can occur in a democracy. It is sometimes said that two competing propagandas cancel each other out. If, however, one regards propaganda not as a debate of ideas or the promulgation of a doctrine, but as psychological manipulation designed to produce action, one understands that these two propagandas, far from canceling each other out because they are contradictory, have a cumulative effect. A boxer, groggy from a left hook, does not return to normal when he is hit with a right hook. He becomes groggier. Now, the modern propagandist likes to speak of his shock effect. And it is indeed a psychological shock that the individual subjected to propaganda suffers. But a second shock from another angle certainly does not revive him. The effect of this double shock is so well known that it is utilized as a technique in a single propaganda by the use of either contradictory news or a tranquilizing propaganda designed to appease the public before launching a great shock that will be felt all the more violently. For example, making propaganda for peace before releasing a violent psychological offensive. On the contrary, a second phenomenon is then produced by these contradictory propagandas. A man whose psychological mechanisms have been set in motion to make him take one action is stopped by the second shock, which acts on the same mechanisms to produce another action. The fact that this man will finally vote for anybody at all is not the important point. What counts is that his normal psychological processes are perverted and will continue to be constantly. To defend himself against that, man automatically creates one of two ways. A. He takes refuge in inertia. In the same way escape into private life, exoticism, the ideal is explained as a means of fleeing the contradictions of modern life. He takes refuge in inertia, in which case propaganda may provoke his rejection. The conflicting propaganda of opposing parties is essentially what leads to political abstention. But this is not the abstention of the free spirit which asserts itself. It is the result of resignation, the external symptom of a series of inhibitions. Such a man has not decided to abstain under diverse pressures, subjected to shocks and distortions. He can no longer perform a political act. What is even more serious is that his inhibition not only is political, but also progressively takes over the whole of his being and leads to a general attitude of surrender. As long as political debates were of little importance and election propaganda dealt with water supplies or rural electrification, this escape reflex was not affecting people's entire lives. But propaganda grows in effectiveness as its themes cause more anxiety. Today, when we are concerned with the rise of dictators and the approach of war, the individual cannot avoid feeling himself drawn in. He cannot shrug his shoulders, but he is rendered passive by propaganda. He cannot just shrug his shoulders, but he is rendered passive by propaganda. The same situation can be found when two contradictory propagandas succeed each other in time. The often studied skepticism of German youth after 1945, that famous formula, Owen Mitch, arose from the counter-shock of a propaganda opposed to Nazi propaganda. Similarly, after the Hungarian Revolution of October 1956, youth threw itself into nihilism, into indifference and personal concerns. These examples demonstrate not the ineffectiveness of propaganda, but on the contrary, its power to profoundly disturb the psychic life. The other defensive reflex is flight into involvement. Political involvement is widespread today because man can no longer bear to remain aloof in an arena of aggressive competition between propagandas. No longer capable of resisting these opposing poles, which reach the deepest levels of his personality, the individual becomes involved. He joins a party to which he then ties himself as totally and deeply as propaganda had intended. From then on, his problem will be solved. He escapes the opposing clash of propagandas. Now, all that his side says is true and right. All that comes from elsewhere is false and wrong. Thus, one propaganda arms him against the other propagandas. This dualism is not entirely contradictory. It can be complementary. To illustrate, in 1959, the Consul Francis des Mouvements de Jeunesse observed that youths were distrustful of all political action, but were at the same time inclined to extreme solutions. Creation of the need for propaganda. A final psychological effect of propaganda is the appearance of the need for propaganda. The individual subjected to propaganda can no longer do without it. This is a form of snowballing. The more propaganda there is, the more the public wants it. The same is true of advertising, which has been said to feed on its own success. It was believed, for example, that advertising on television would supplant newspaper advertising, but it was found, on the contrary, that television actually increased the total volume of advertising business. The need for a growing volume of propaganda involves two apparently contradictory phenomena: mithridization and sensibilization. Mithridization is a toxic antitoxin process whereby a person is rendered immune to a poison by tolerating gradually increased doses of it. Sensibilization is the increase of sensitivity or susceptibility. Mithridization or Mithridization. It is known that under the effect of propaganda, the individual gradually closes up. Having suffered too many propaganda shocks, he becomes accustomed and insensitive to them. He no longer looks at posters. To him they are just splashes of color. He no longer hears a radio speech. It is nothing but sound, a background noise for his activity. He no longer reads the newspaper, but merely skims distractedly over it. One may therefore be tempted to say, "You see how the excess of propaganda no longer has a hold of this man. He reacts with indifference. He escapes it. He is mithridized against propaganda." What a fucked up word. Should I look up how to say it? Mithridized.
Mithridatize.
Mithridatize. Jeez. Okay. Nevertheless, this same individual continues to turn on his radio and buy his newspaper. He is mithridatized, yes. But to what? Only to the objective and intellectual content of propaganda. True, he has become indifferent to the theme of propaganda, the idea, the argument, to everything that could form his opinion. He no longer needs to read the newspaper or listen to the speech because he knows their ideological content in advance and that it would change none of his attitudes. But though it is true that after a certain time the individual becomes indifferent to the propaganda content, that does not mean that he has become insensitive to propaganda, that he turns from it, that he is immune. It means exactly the opposite. For not only does he keep buying his newspaper, but he also continues to follow the trend and obey the rules. He continues to obey the catchwords of propaganda, though he no longer listens to it. His reflexes still function, i.e., he has not become independent through Mithridization. He is simply imbued with the symbols of propaganda. He is entirely dominated and manipulated. He no longer needs to see and read the poster. The simple splash of color is enough to awaken the desired reflexes in him. In reality, though, he is Mithridatized to ideological content. He is sensitized to propaganda itself. Sensibilization. The more the individual is captured by propaganda, the more sensitive he is, not to its content, but to the impetus it gives him, but to the impetus it gives him, to the excitement it makes him feel. What does impetus mean again? Impetus. The force by which the body moves, energy. Impetus, right?
Impetus.
That's a good synonym for impetus. Force, drive. The drive it gives him, to the excitement it makes him feel. The smallest excitement, the feeblest stimulus, activates his conditioned reflexes, awakens the myth, and produces the action that the myth demands. Up to this point, an enormous amount of manipulation, a substantial dose of cleverly coordinated stimuli was required to achieve this in him. The motivating drives of his psyche had to be reached. The doors of his unconscious had to be forced open. His attitudes and habits had to be broken and new behavior determined. This meant the use of methods and techniques at once subtle and crushing. But once the individual has been filled with and reshaped by propaganda, action by so many methods is no longer necessary. The smallest dose now suffices. It is enough to refresh, to give a booster shot, to repaint, and the individual obeys in striking fashion, like certain drunks who become intoxicated on one glass of wine. The individual no longer offers any resistance to propaganda. Moreover, he has ceased to believe in it consciously. He no longer attaches importance to what it says, to its proclaimed objectives, but he acts according to the proper stimuli. Here we find again the disassociation between action and thought of which we spoke earlier. The individual is arrested and crystallized with regard to his thinking. It is in this domain of opinion that Mithridization takes place. But in the domain of action, he is actually mobilized. He responds to the changing propaganda inputs. He acts with vigor and certainty, indeed with perception. He is a ready activist, but his action is purely irrational. That is the effect of his sensibilization to propaganda. An individual who has arrived at this point has a constant and irresistible need for propaganda. He cannot bear to have it stop. We can readily understand why this is so when we think of his condition. A. He lived in anxiety, and propaganda gave him certainty. Now his anxiety doubles at the very instant when propaganda stops. All the more so because In this terrible silence that suddenly surrounds him, he, who permitted himself to be led, no longer knows where to go, and all around him he hears violent clamor and other propagandas seeking to influence him and seduce him, and which increase his confusion. B. Propaganda removed from him his subhuman situation and gave him a feeling of self-importance. Propaganda removed from him his subhuman situation and gave him a feeling of self-importance. It permitted him to assert himself and satisfied his need for active participation. When it stops, he finds himself more powerless than before, with a feeling of impotence all the more intense because he had come to believe in the effectiveness of his actions. He is suddenly plunged into apathy and has no personal way of getting out of it. He acquires a conviction of his unworthiness much more violent than he has felt before, because for a while he has believed in his worth. C. Finally, propaganda gave him justification. The individual needs to have this justification constantly renewed. He needs it in some form at every step, for every action, as a guarantee that he is on the right path. When propaganda ceases, he loses his justification. He no longer has confidence in himself. He feels guilty because under the influence of propaganda, he performed deeds that he now dreads, or for which he is remorseful. Thus, he has even more need for justification. After he plunges into despair, when propaganda ceases to provide him with the certainty of his justice and his motives. When propaganda ceases in a group where it has had powerful effect, what do we see? A social disintegration of the group and a corresponding internal disintegration of the individuals within it. They completely withdraw into themselves and reject all participation in social or political life. Through uncertainty, through fear, through discouragement, they begin to feel that everything is useless, that there is no need to have opinions or participate in political life. They are now wholly disinterested in all that was the center of their lives. As far as they are concerned, everything will go on henceforth without me. The group, as such, loses its value in the eyes of the individual, and its disintegration follows from this attitude of its members. Egocentricity is the product of the cessation of propaganda in such fashion that it appears irremediable. Not only egocentric withdrawal, but also genuine nervous or mental troubles such as schizophrenia, paranoia, and guilt complexes are sometimes found in those who have been dominated by a propaganda that has ceased. Such individuals must then compensate for the absence of propaganda with psychiatric treatment. These effects could be seen in countries where propaganda suddenly stopped, as in Hitler's Germany in 1945 or in the United States in 1946. To take two very different examples. The reaction just described corresponds well to the alienation effected by propaganda. Man is diminished. He can no longer live alone, decide for himself, or alone assume the burden of his life. He needs a guardian, a director of conscience, and feels ill when he does not have them. Sometimes he is even aware of this. Reisman gives the remarkable example of individuals who complain that their psychological services are not active enough, that they have not been manipulated in such a manner as to enjoy the inconveniences of their lives. Thus, a need for propaganda arises, which education can no longer change. From the moment the individual is caught, he needs his ration of pseudo-intellectual nourishment, of nervous and emotional stimulation, of catchwords, and of social integration. Propaganda must therefore be unceasing. This leads us back to a question we raised earlier: the durability of propaganda effects. Through the creation of a need for propaganda and the required psychic transformations, propaganda has profound and relatively durable effects. But the specific content of propaganda, the substance that at any given time serves to satisfy this need and to reduce tensions, obviously has only a temporary and momentary effect, and must therefore be refreshed and renewed all the time, particularly as the satisfactions that propaganda gives are always in the immediate present. For this reason, propaganda is not very durable. But this statement must be qualified. We have said that propaganda cannot run counter to an epoch's deep-seated trends and collective presuppositions. But when propaganda acts in the direction and support of these, its effect becomes very durable on both the intellectual and emotional level. Nowadays, propaganda hostile to the state, opposed to progress, would have no chance whatever of succeeding. But if it supports the state, it will penetrate deeply into man's consciousness. The need for propaganda then tends to make this penetration permanent. The duration, the permanence of propaganda, thus leads to the genuine durability of its effects. When these effects are constantly reproduced and their stimulus is endlessly renewed, they obviously affect the individual in depth. He learns to act and react in a particular way. He has not, however, undergone a permanent or total modification of his personality. Propaganda is concerned with the most pressing and at the same time the most elementary actuality. It proposes immediate action of the most ordinary kind. Otherwise, it is no longer propaganda. It becomes academic without effect. It is less a matter of general ideas than of familiarizing the worker with the practical decisions of the party. It thus plunges the individual into the immediate present, taking from him all mastery of his life and all sense of the duration or continuity of any action or thought. Thus, the propagandee becomes a man without a past and without a future, a man who receives from propaganda his portion of thought and action for the day. His discontinuous personality must be given continuity from the outside, and this makes the need for propaganda very strong. When the propagandee ceases to receive his propaganda, he experiences the feeling of being cut off from his own past or of facing a completely unpredictable future, of being separated from the world he lives in. Because propaganda has been his only channel for perceiving the world, he has the feeling of being delivered, tied hand and foot to an unknown destiny. Thus, from the moment propaganda begins, with its machine and its organization, one can no longer stop it. It can only grow and perfect itself, for its discontinuation would ask too great a sacrifice of the propagandee, a too thorough remaking of himself. This is more than he is ready to accept. It's a good spot to stop. Pick that up. The next reading. Have a great day. Oh, I'm on the wrong. It's meant to be here.